Good evening and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean-Paul Garnier, and today we are here to celebrate the wonderful novella, The Dragonfly Gambit from A.D. Sway. A.D. Sway is a Ukrainian-born, queer, and disabled speculative fiction writer, a failed academic and retired fencer. She spends her days wrangling her two dogs and hundreds of tropical plants. Her writing has appeared in Dark Matter magazine, Augur, Heaven Spec, and others. I'm going to hand it over to AD to read us an excerpt from The Dragonfly Gambit.
Thank you so much. I'm also incredibly chilly because London, Ontario has decided to switch into pre-winter mode. The section I'll be reading to you today is slightly different from what I usually read. This comes a little later in the novella. So our protagonist, Naz, has already been picked up and by her friend, Shay. And so she has been picked up and transported. She doesn't know where she is. Don't worry, there's no spoilers coming up. So this is their first interaction post fact. I don't blame you, I say, still slurring. Oh no, what am I replying to? All of us had to find ways to survive. You found yours in uniform. I don't take it personally. Shay watches with wary eyes and nods along. Whatever sedative knocked me out must have produced hints of unwanted amnesia. My brain started recording only now, but we could have been chatting for hours. Oh no. The room is anything but cozy. A two-way mirror shimmers in the dim lights, and there are at least four cameras by the ceiling that I can count. Five, if you include the pin camera on Shay's chest. I flex my legs and drive my heels into the floor. Wherever we are now, we're not planet-side. Shay has given me magnetic soles and left my arms uncuffed. This just might be more of a conversation than a beating. Now that we've put some distance behind us, let's have a chat, Shay says. Detached? Professional? I nod along as I tense various parts of my body to test their function. Looks like the sedative is the only thing that was used. They transported me in a rush, probably unconscious. My left shoulder aches as if I've been laying on it for too long. I have yet to piss myself, but honestly, I'm not even sure I'm wearing the same pants as when I left my apartment, which, by these estimates, puts us between 6 and 8 hours of travel time, with an extra half an hour to throw my unconscious body like a sack of potatoes on and off shuttle. I'd say we're halfway to the front lines. Normally, I'd agree that everything they've done to me so far was a well deserved consequence of my actions. The usual sabotage, treason, I dabble in a few. But the lack of actual consequences is unnerving. I wouldn't go as far as to say it was treason, Shay says. Broadcasting the details of Vice Admiral Trapet's divorce to every station that would listen hardly constitutes a crime against the rule, although I did find it highly entertaining. He grins, and I break into a sweat at how little control I have over keeping my thoughts inside my head, where they belong. Shay's aware of this. You've been busy since we last saw each other. Yes, I wasn't exactly sitting there twiddling my thumbs for a decade. You developed shield penetrating drones. You obtained and revealed classified locations of the major fleet operations. You shut down payroll on 3 major rule carriers. And of course, Shay raises his eyebrows, you managed to leak fighter schematics to the breakaways. They had those already. First daughter herself armed the annex systems. I don't believe that to be true. But the thing about the truth is that you don't have to believe in it for it to still be the truth. Truth shouldn't bend to favoritism. One such truth is that the Oran system, my home, faithfully adhered to the assimilation agreement, allowing their children to be conscripted for the rule's fleet as long as the system itself was allowed to maintain some of its governing power. Shay, Kaya, and yes, me, ended up in the rule's ranks thanks to that requirement. That is a truth, one I begrudgingly accept. Once there were suspicions that Orin might break away from the rule, all assimilation agreements were thrown out. The entire system, all 15 planets that compromised, was vaporized sometime before I was discharged. It wasn't personal, just like Shay coming to collect me wasn't personal. This is also a truth I must accept. Kaya and Shay continue to serve despite what happened to our home. I still struggle with that one. We're not here for the first daughter, I say. We're here to put an end to pointless fighting. Oh, has the third daughter decided to surrender? A faint smile flickers across Shay's lips. Naz, he warns. The air grows thick between us, and I brace for a thunderstorm. I'm not going to help you optimize your baby killing. The sudden pain is blinding. I twist my inside with an iron claw as I double over and hurl all over my pants, then hurl again on the floor. When my vision returns, my forehead presses against the metal table, and there's rust in my mouth. I force a laugh. When did you implant that? There's a shaved patch at the nape of my neck, which also happens to be the epicenter of the pain. There's no answer. A second shock shatters my world. Something about where the implant sits in my neck causes it to impact the left side more than the right. My arm convulses with bone shattering strength. Luckily, my stomach is empty, and I just dry heave until the shock passes. Oof, is all I can manage. Shay swivels in his chair, back and forth, like a bored toddler. Years away from any real action have made you soft, Nez. He leans over and gives me a pat on the shoulder. Don't forget, you were once a baby killer in training too, eager to see some baby killing action. Don't get all high and mighty. The third daughter doesn't need nor want your loyalty or any sort of change of heart. She simply wants you to optimize our fighters. Shock me all you want. I pause to spit out a piece of protein I ingested 2 days ago. 3? Time is weird right now. But you've pushed your fighter's tech to its limit. There's nothing more I can do. You won't squeeze much else out of it. Or me. I promise you there's nothing more left of me. Shay shrugs. The creases around the corners of his eyes weren't there when we last saw one another. We share in the damp silence, inhaling the putrid smell wafting from the floor. Well, he says at last, with a wistful smile, you do have a talent for making something out of scraps. Try and apply yourself. The third daughter might have a gentle hand compared to her sisters, but intelligence and investigations tends to correct for that. He leaves me alone then, the puddle of bile and the contents of my stomach on the floor. And if I could, I'd cry. But there's nothing in my stomach, not to mention the rest of me. For the first time, what I think is 2 days, there's a moment of silence, a reprieve, and I wish for nothing more than it to end. I dig my nails into my forearm, but the pain barely registers. One fucking vertebra. One vertebra bursting was enough to end a career, enough to end a future. But then, what kind of future would it have been, flying for the rule? I shouldn't blame Kaya for what happened, but I do. Kaya Louds, the Iron Fox, the ace of the rule, the best fighter pilot in the galaxy, supposedly, according to the third daughter, and to the millions of propaganda posters around any spaceport. But it wasn't always like that. She wasn't always spewing militant garbage from an impersonal hologram, the face of the rule's fleet a million miles away. I rest my head against the table again. No matter how tightly I shut my eyes, the world spins. No, she used to be much closer. The door opens, and even without raising my head, I can tell that Shay's back for me. Time to go, he says, cold and rehearsed, just as they taught him in the academy and enforced through years of service. Money well spent. I have a feeling he won't let me change. Will Kaya be there? Don't worry about that right now. I take it as a yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much
That
for sharing that excerpt with us. So we're going to move into the interview portion of the event. If anyone in the audience has questions, please do feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll try to get to them all. So the Dragonfly Gambit has all the elements of space opera, a big story, politics, empire, world building, and so forth. But unlike most contemporary space opera, the book is short. It's a novella. How did you manage to create such a large scale story in so few words? And what are your feelings on the subgenre of space opera?
Huh, great question. So first of all, I think novellas are having their kind of time in the sun right now. I think novellas as a length are perfect, perfect. I don't think many folks have the time to just kind of dedicate evening after evening after evening to a story, but a novella is great because, you sit down for a couple of hours on a Friday night and you're done and you have the whole story. So I do like intrinsically have a preference towards novellas now. Um, I grew up on space operas of like the 70s. I think one of the first books I read in translation to Ukrainian was like Asimov's Foundation. um, Far too young to like fully understand it, but um, I think space operas have had this very interesting history of almost glamorizing empire and glamorizing this sort of like colonial conquest. And so I really, really enjoy the new wave of anti imperialist and anti colonial space opera. Susan Palumbo's Countess comes to mind. And that's kind of where I wanted to go with it. And in terms of getting the space opera size into a novella, um, I can't remember who said it. It might have been an agency sibling, but he said in a book, you tend to fight for every paragraph. Each paragraph has to earn its right to exist on the page. You can't just like have a frivolous one. In a short story, every sentence is fighting for its existence because you're constrained by how many words you have. And a novella is somewhere in between. And so you get really, really mindful about what each and every sentence is doing. You have a little more space. So even though Dragonfly is kind of pacier, there are a few moments there where I could just not think about progressing plot forward. And I could just be like, okay, we're building character or we're having this like quiet moment, which in a shorter form I wouldn't be able to do. But outside of that, like every two sentences, I was like, are we getting new information? Are we doing world building? Are we doing world building and character development? Um, and that was a lot of fun and very, very difficult to edit um, because I naturally don't write dense, and I had to write dense, if that makes sense.
It does, and it packs a lot of punch while being like a completely fast-paced page turner. So it's a one sitting book for most people, I think. Very effective. One of the themes that I found in the book to be intriguing was the theme of sacrifice, almost to the degree of martyrdom. And in the culture of the book, sacrifice is also seen as an arcane tradition. Can you speak a little bit about the nature of sacrifice and weighing an individual character against very large scale problems?
Hmm, that is a very complicated question. And not one I actually get asked a lot about this novella, so thank you. Um, I think there's definitely um, it's sacrifice specifically within the military context. And I wanted to kind of place it within the military context because there is almost a thematic thread of martyrdom within militaries, right? Like folks who die in combat, folks who give their lives in combat are elevated to this level of heroes, right? We do our best to immortalize them. They get medals, and I think in a way it's interesting because yes, they are doing that, but also it's kind of part of the job. Um, I also like the idea of these little um, almost rituals that persist, even though you have technologies and you're looking at a time scale that's far, far ahead of kind of where we are. These little almost superstitions persist. Um, and we have this very like tenuous relationship to them where we understand that it's like this is probably not the thing determining the fate of the battle. Um, but better safe than sorry. These little superstitions. And I think specifically in the context of novella, it intersects nicely with the idea of regular soldiers sacrificing themselves for this bigger cause because it's almost seen as like to everybody else it's a noble act, but within it it's just a check mark. And so in a way it plays with this idea that like folks are losing their individuality, folks are becoming just another check mark on this giant roster of people who sacrifice themselves for the cause. And then playing with the idea of like, how does that fit with the bigger kind of imperial machine and how people buy into ideas that are not great, how propaganda can be used to sway people to rally behind causes that are horribly oppressive. And they're not bad people, right? But everyone kind of has a reason to be there. Everyone is surviving in some way. Um, I feel like I'm getting kind of away from your question, but I'm also very, very fascinated with not so much sacrifice, but the way that people face death. And I get to play a lot with that idea through Nez's character. Um, I don't want to spoil anything, right? Because you have to get to an end. But there's one line that kind of makes you go, "Oh, you know, maybe there isn't all of this resolved. Maybe there is a lot of regret. Maybe she doesn't want to kind of commit all the way to her cause." Um, and I'm very interested into how people face how they face the end because both her and the third daughter um, are kind of plummeting towards their ends together. Um, and it's kind of what kind of face do you put on in a way. From a practical perspective, the idea of sacrifice in the face of like these big machines, these huge institutions, unfortunately, I think it's a remnant of this like idea that one single hero can change the course of a rebellion, a war. I don't think it's very realistic, but that's why it's a space opera. It's kind of I can dream. I think we're all kind of thinking that we could change historical events if we really tried. Um, yeah, that's a very, very long way of answering your question.
That's perfectly all right. It is a complicated subject. So many of the characters in the book are fighter pilots, some propagandized as the literal poster pilot for the war. And there's some epic dogfights in the book. So I wanted to ask a little bit if you could tell us about writing action scenes in space and what issues do you face when doing this? Because most of us haven't been in zero G and all that.
Oh, that's fun. I am notoriously bad at writing bodies in motion, and like understanding where things are. So one of my beta readers is like notoriously bad at following fight sequences. So she's like, I love this fantasy novel. I loved it. But anytime they're fighting with their swords, I don't know what's going on. And I was like, you're perfect. You're going to read all my dogfight scenes and tell me then, like, what happens. So that's how I know it's like, it makes sense. But the thing with space is like the notion of up and down just kind of goes out the window. Um, and then you're really, if you're trying to decelerate, you can't just like press a brake because you're accelerating in a direction. So decelerate, you have to create force in the opposite direction. So you have to like flip your thrusters or something to that extent. If you want to rapidly decelerate, you need to create energy going the other way so it stops you. Um, but also like as much as I like describing them as like almost jet-like, the fighters don't need to be any sort of aerodynamic shape because there's like no air resistance. They could just be cubes. And that's like a fun thought experiment if you read all the like dogfight scenes, but they're just like in little cubes like flying around. Because yeah, there's no air resistance. They're not fighting anything. They're just like zooming around. Um, and I like truthfully, I watched a lot of The Expanse, and I think The Expanse does like the show does a really good job of on screen portraying how acceleration, deceleration, and like maneuvering would work. So I watched that and I was like, oh, how are they doing it? And then I also watched a lot of videos of military pilots doing their centrifuge training and just like the different techniques that they use so they don't like black out really quickly. So yeah, I watched like 3 hours of guys just having their faces like stretched and sagged under the G's. I was like, hmm, fascinating. Okay. Just writing it down. Yeah. So that's kind of how I got into that.
It comes across, and yeah, like you said, there's no full stop. No, it's no
No,
Star Trek hit the pump the brakes. Switching gears a little bit here, I found the book to be written in this almost casual tone that really emphasized the confidence of the protagonist, Nez. And can you speak about her self-assuredness, even amongst the disability she's facing and being ostracized by those that she was involved with before the book happened?
it's interesting to me that it reads as confidence um, because I personally, I see it as like rage, as like simmering rage the entire time. And the humor that peeks through is just like that's my like Eastern European brain working because gallows humor is like kind of how we get through the world. Um, but I think for her, it's just like it's just being really angry at people, like being super, super pissed at them. And like in a way, her having her accident and her not being able to go back kind of gives her this pause to get her head right and being out of that space, being like, oh shit, like we're the baddies. Like something needs to be done because this is getting kind of out of control. And here's this chance. Let's see if I can capitalize on it. And I think for her, there's this very complicated relationship with kind of her body as a whole, where she understands, she sees herself as just as capable, just as ruthless as everybody else. But it's kind of through the eyes of others that she sees, like, oh, you actually see me as lesser than now. You don't see the utility in me. So, like, okay, that sucks. Let me use it. But even though she uses it to her advantage, there's still moments where like it truly gets to her and you kind of see it get past the confidence, the anger, the humor. And you get these like little snippets of like genuine moments of like, I feel really crappy about this. But fun fact, a bunch of stuff that people like say to her is just stuff that people said to me. It's like not made up. And when I tell that to people, they're like, there's no way. And a lot of people really don't filter how they feel about disabled people occupying just like life and appearing in public spaces. Um, so yeah, that came from like a very, like very personal space. I'm like, I wonder if I can just throw that in there It's like, what's some of the worst shit that people said? Pardon my language. By the way, this novella has 40 F-bombs in 40,000 words. So that's one F-bomb per 1,000 words. And that is my marketing spiel.
No censorship here, so please cuss all that you want to. If the audience is uncomfortable, you can plug your ears. Um, when I say confidence, she comes off as a total badass, and that's what I mean. And
Really?
I feel like the language expressed that, and I loved that. And similarly, but almost in the inverse, your antagonist, the third daughter, Razel, am I pronouncing her name correctly?
Sure. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I think I meant for it to be Rizal.
Okay, Rizal.
Like that's it.
She sort of, I felt like in a way she masks her weaknesses with this bravado, this very big bravado. And I wonder if you could speak about this choice and how her character counterbalances Nez.
I think it comes down to expectations. Um, the third daughter has the expectation that she will end this war. And like it or not, she has to make it happen. Um, where, this is so hard to say without spoiling anything. Oh, uh, but she is the face of the rule effectively. She has a reputation. Um, she knows that her sisters have failed. And so all of this weight is upon her, and she has to act the part. The part that Nez gets to play is the poor little cripple. I'm going to use that word. Sorry. She gets called that. It's there. There's a confident wording, I think, maybe. She gets to play that role and fly under the radar, so to speak, to get where she needs to. And so they're both kind of playing with expectations. Um, and because they don't really know each other's true selves for the longest time, um, there's this whole like double crossing. I don't know what you're really about. I don't know what you're really about, but they're trying to screw each other over, which is super fun to write. I love it when people can't say the thing or they can't like, they have to do like two layers of bullshitting um, to get to the end of the story. Except now you have two characters who are doing that to each other. So yeah, they're they're very much like they're kind of in the same boat, but they're approaching it from two very different sides.
We're
Yeah.
gonna come back to their relationship in a bit here because it's a very complex and rich one. But I want to shift gears for a second here. A lot of the story takes place on spaceships, um, but the decadence of power is very vividly described. The unnecessary accoutrements of power and wealth. And I wonder if you could talk about using setting, the way you used setting to explore power dynamics.
Hmm. Huh. That's really interesting. I did want to play on the like over the top aristocratic kind of environments. Okay. And the reason I did this is because I am Ukrainian and Russian culture has been taught to me and shoved down my throat as inherently superior. And when you think Russian culture, you think what? You think ballet, you think fine china, you think tea, you think extravagant food, balls, golden frames, and all of that stuff. So I kind of shoved it in there because that's my idea of like quote unquote cultural superiority or the way that it is performed. Here's all this money. Um, and then you have Nez, who kind of gets by on very, very little. And even when she's aboard the ship, she's kind of like bare bones little room, which is almost done as like on purpose. Like this is the most that you deserve, and you'll be thankful for it, right? Um, and again, it's just this juxtaposition. It's like for Nez, there's this constant reminder. Every person around her is like, you're nothing. you're not useful. You are at best a tool. At worst, you are completely useless and invisible. And so, kind of leaning into that environment, description of like she doesn't get to see that level of extravagance often. She doesn't get to touch it. She doesn't get to be a part of it. And it almost creates like this obsession in her. And to her, the third daughter symbolizes that in a way. Um, and she's like, I don't know if it's the propaganda or it's because she's really hot or because she's freaking crazy, but like she is obsessed with her. And it's not on a level. I've heard some people say it's like, oh, it's enemies to lovers. I'm like, no, 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 no. There is no love. There is no single ounce of love in this book. However, there is this obsession with all of this stuff that I am starved of. I will take it and I will take it on my terms.
The third
Yeah.
daughter's quarters, the contrast it provides to this military spaceship environment was quite rich, and also said so much about her character, that I found that intriguing.
But it's
And
like she exists in a different world. Like I wanted that to be very obvious. Like, yes, she is a part of this military machine, but like she is the last to go. Like if shit hits the fan, she will be as the special one protected at all costs. Yeah.
she reeked of privilege in those scenes. Absolutely. Um, One aspect of the characters that really stuck out to me as interesting and complicated to make this story wonderful is the tenderness between adversaries. Not love, as you said, but a tenderness at times between adversaries. So, how did you use this to heighten the drama of the story? That super complicated relationship between them.
I think those moments come from a place of like game recognized game. Um, and I think it's like at some point of this novella, it's like does reflect on the whole situation. It's like if under any other circumstances, like if you were literally anybody else, then the person who is essentially vaporized entire systems, then this could be something. But you're not. You're inherently corrupted to the core and you stand for something that is truly awful. And so I will bring you down. But there is that tension because she's like, oh, finally, there is a worthy opponent. And I think for the third daughter, there's also that. Um, it's just like in a very twisted way, it's like when serial killers like get tired of escaping and they just kind of like, I wish somebody would just catch me, but I'm also not gonna just like show up at the police station. Like, hey. Um, and I think the third daughter to an extent is tired and realizes the extent of her abilities and she craves her own demise. And in Nez, she sees that opportunity, but it's not simple. Like it's not, it is refined, it is up to her taste. So it kind of fuels their little game because they're both clever and they're both really, really stabby in a way. Um, and any other characterization would not make them work as like foils, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And in relation to that question, um, tell us about the use of sexuality as a weapon, the interplay between seduction versus betrayal, and how the ultimate corruption of power plays into all this, while personal feelings are also on the line amidst this really high stakes, not necessarily personal situation.
Oh, geez. um, First of all, thanks to Dave for like not editing the one sex scene that I have. Because that would have probably made me want to lie down in a corner and just like, please do not perceive me. Um, but I think it's not so much that I wanted to humanize um, Resolve, because I think kind of the humanity has gone from her. I think it's that she can fake it. And those feelings, whether they're genuine or not, I don't know. We're not inside her head, whatever. But she can feign it. And it's almost like sometimes bad people can be like so good to some people that you almost start to question their entire badness. You're like, but look here, there is this genuine emotion. You genuinely care for this person. You can't possibly be capable of these atrocities, but they can be, and they commit them. And I think we're kind of past this moment of fiction where our villains are just like villains. They're totally bad, and our heroes are totally good. But I still think there's more room for nuance. We're not, it's a very uncomfortable thought that you could meet somebody who is very attractive, because pretty privilege is a total thing, and we tend to attribute goodness to beautiful people. Somebody can be beautiful, somebody can, in moments, prove to be caring and gentle, and still just be completely unhinged and like a sociopath. Those two can coexist, and you see it because the moment that Edis doesn't get what she wants, or she doesn't get it as quickly as she wants, she utilizes kind of whatever twisted methods she can. And I think Nez again like plays at that, plays with these potentially genuine, potentially not genuine emotions to kind of get her way. Um, I also think seeing that in like a queer context is really fun, um, because we kind of get the like the what is it called? The honeypot in spy thrillers,
Oh, the
like sex
honey
people.
trap.
Honey trap. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Uh, where am I going with this? Oh yeah, we see it, but it's like usually like heterosexual pairings, which is cool. But like I wanted it to be done in a queer context, and I kind of wanted those like sexuality and like lust tend to bring up the more extreme emotions, and you see that in terms of like jealousy and territoriality and all of these things. And I wanted to like pull at that and get the heightened nasty, ugly emotions out of my characters. Because that's always, as a writer, you don't want to write happy emotions. You want to write the like unsightly ones, you know?
And the relationship kept me guessing a little bit because in a way it's like, oh, is the armor coming off right now? Is this sensitivity going to be allowed? And one of the things that I thought was really wonderful about this book is in a way it's almost an exercise in contrast. You've got these scenes that alternate between what feels like caring and utter deep cruelty. And also this macro situation versus an interpersonal micro situation. Can you talk a little bit about using contrast in your storytelling?
I think it plays very well to pacing. Um, I think fast, fast, fast gets the reader really tired, even in a novella format. Um, it can get very tiring. You're like, I need to take a breath, right? And so when I was writing it, it'd be like, I am really tired at the end of this scene. Like I'm mentally exhausted. And so I would put in a slightly slower scene, a slightly like more emotionally relaxed one. And then I would be like, oh, okay, now I need to ramp up the torture. Um, and I think the pacing kind of naturally started to kind of ebb and flow until it needed to pick up, and it just needed to go boom, 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 dominoes are falling. Um, it also, I attempted I don't know to what degree successfully, to have things mirror. So a lot of interpersonal stuff would mirror the macro events and so forth. And so when the dominoes started falling, the dominoes were not only falling in the interpersonal stuff, they were also falling on the macro scale. And it's like then things were kind of crashing towards the end, and we could be like, oh, okay, here it comes, here comes the big consequence, here comes the big um blowout interpersonal. I It's really difficult to talk about this without spoiling it and giving you a play by play of exactly what happened.
I appreciate though avoiding spoilers because for those who haven't read the book, you're in for a treat, and we don't want to give everything away. Sorry if the questions are needling into that territory. Um, Back to your writing process a bit. This book has a lot of layers. I've called it rich several times, and it certainly is. That there's a lot of layers. In a way, it's very complicated for a short story while being very easy to follow. But I wonder in the writing process, are you a plotter? How did you deal with those layers? Did you know where you were heading, or do you what are the pants? Are you a pantser? I don't really like that term, but you know what I mean.
I am both. So this idea existed before I started writing, truly. It existed for about 5 years now. And I didn't know how to approach it. In its original form, it was truly a Gundam story. It was a mecha suit story. And because I grew up on the classic, like original Gundam series, and I was like, I want to recreate this, but I want to make it for a Western audience. And at the time, I didn't know how to write stories and put them together. And so obviously that didn't go anywhere. And then I got into writing and I started reading Neon Hemlock novellas. And I thought, this is fantastic. And then Dave came out with a call for novellas. And it was beginning of September. And Dave said, beginning of October is when we open. And I had a vibe of an idea and no novella. And I was like, I gotta make this call. So I sat down, and usually the way that I plot varies by project. So, like, you can't really see it, but there's like this little post-it note over there. Oh, yeah, right there. It's tiny. It's a tiny post-it note, but that was an entire novel outline. For this, it was a little longer, so I had a notebook, and it was literally a stream of consciousness of like this happens and then Ness talks to these people and just run on sentence. And I wrote it in a really short time. And I think that helped with the voice a lot because it's quite voicey. And when I go back to it, I'm like, oh, okay, this is quite consistent, which I think is a lot harder to do in a longer work. But a fun tidbit is that I wrote half of it in past tense. And then when I was about 20,000 words in, I realized that it worked better as a present tense. And then I had a little existential moment and I cried for about 3 hours saying, I've made a horrible mistake. I don't know how to write anymore. It sounds bad. And then I reworked it in present tense and it made sense. And the pacing felt like almost more aggressive. And I was like, sweet, okay, crisis averted. Um, but it went through just a very fast drafting process and then a very fast edit. And then obviously more edits on Dave's side when it got picked up. Um, but that was the process. It felt because it is quite personal and deals with a lot of stuff that is personal to me. It felt like in the worst way possible, emotional vomit. I would feel exhausted after writing it because all of the terrible, terrible things that I internalized about my own disability and that were said to me because of my disability, I had to like remember it, go back to that place and put it on page over and over and over and over again for like weeks on end. Um, yeah, so it was physically also because I was writing a lot of words per day. It was physically exhausting. So the entire process was just like a whirlwind. And then I submitted it, and then Dave read it, and he came down with COVID. And so he thought that he hallucinated the entire novella in like a fever dream. So then when he felt better, he just moved on with his life. And then he just put out a call being like, if you have a novella with these vibes, and I was like, you have it. And he was like, oh, I thought that was a hallucination. And that's the story of this novella. And one day I'll stop talking about how this novella gave Dave Ray COVID, but today is not that day.
That's pretty amazing, though. It was in his psyche. Um,
He read it and just went, yeah, there's no way somebody, nah, nah, it's okay.
that
Didn't
that's pretty
happen.
wonderful. I love writing when I have a fever or sickness because it alters your consciousness, but I never thought of like getting into the slush pile that way.
Yeah.
That what a story. Um, so you mentioned that, in certain passages of these book and drawing on the personal experience that it was difficult, but on the other end of it, now that the book is out in readers' hands, has that altered into something empowering?
I'd say in a way, I think in anything I write, I try to put, I don't write from positive emotion a lot. I think that's kind of like my MO. I tend to write from very like not great feelings. Um, and in a way, it helps me put a lot of them to rest. Like, I have a strange theory that if I put it into a work and I release it and people view it favorably, then that terrible thing that I've been hiding and kind of suppressing is not so terrible. Um, and so with Dragonfly, at the beginning, it was very interesting talking about something that was kind of very, very personal. And the friends I've had for, over a decade read this, and there's a few ahem, Easter eggs for people who know me really, really well. And they were like, oh, I was like, you're not allowed to come anywhere with me. In fact, you're not allowed to read this anymore. I'm going to take it away. And then, kind of as I talked about it more, and as I started to look at it more as a just piece of storytelling than a part of me that I put out into the world, um, the more it became empowering, less from a identity and like disability perspective, and more empowering from a writing skill perspective. Because people would tell me how much they liked it and how they were surprised and how pacey it was. And I was like, wow, I did that. That's kind of cool. And since it's my first longer work, it was kind of a mystery whether I could do it or not, um, at least to me. And when it came out and people kind of spoke favorably about it, it really made me feel a lot more comfortable with my writing and with that specific voiciness of it. Um, and writing action scenes, because until then I hadn't written an action scene. I thought it would be terrible, but it wasn't.
Well, success. This is your first longer work. Yeah, you nailed it. Um, Back to one more question about writing. Um, you mentioned earlier, like watching hours of videos of human centrifuge. Personal personal experiences aside, what sort of research do you typically do from one book to another? And I know that can differ quite greatly. But what's your research process look like?
Yeah, so it depends on how outside of my expertise I need to, or like my knowledge base I have to veer out of. So for like some short stories and some books, I would like brush up on some stuff that I learned before. I have a neuro undergrad, and for one of my um, novel drafts, I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna have to go home. I'm gonna have to fish out my neuro textbooks from my parents' basement." And I did, and then I also had to pull a bunch of papers, like academic papers about very, very specific um, hallucinogens because I had completely forgot how things synthesize in the brain. Um, and then other things, I don't really need to go as deep. Like I can watch a few refresher videos and just be like, oh yeah, I remember how this works. Um, I think the deepest like research hole wasn't even a research hole. It was my partner had to explain what a regression towards the mean is, like in large data sets. And I'm a qualitative researcher, so stats was like not great, but we kind of hit an impasse where I needed to understand how it worked for me to be able to write it. And I'm like, I guess I'm learning stats. Like this, this is happening. Um, I recently heard about that Ted Chiang did 5 years of linguistics research for Story of Your Life. And I heard that and I thought, man, he wanted to do a good job with the story so badly. He went out and practically got a PhD in linguistics. That is dedication. I can't do that. I will, however, watch a lot of video essays. I will kind of watch videos that are scientific communication. For anything space related, David Kipping has the I think it's Strange Worlds, his channel is called, but he does all kinds of astrophysics stuff. And a lot of ideas I get for my stories are from those videos because he does such a fantastic job of relaying very, very complicated astrophysics information in like a very accessible way. So my research process is all over the place. I reread textbooks or I just binge watch somebody's YouTube channel. There is nothing in between.
For me, it's PBS Space Time. It's like whenever I get anxious, I go to that show, and he's kind of cute, so it's distracting, but like it's so information rich. If you haven't checked out that one, it's endless source of wonderful information. Um, one more
I'm
question
writing
about
it
the
down.
yeah, PBS Space Time. It's fabulous. Um, one more question about the book. In some ways, well, in a lot of ways, this is a book about revenge. But to me, it totally didn't feel like your classic revenge tale. Um, how did you navigate this kind of trope that has such a history, but like make it feel completely fresh?
Hmm. I think it's because, and I will admit this, I've actually not consumed a lot of media that utilizes the revenge trope. And I think that kind of worked in my favor. I didn't have a preconceived notion of like what it was supposed to look like, what it was supposed to sound like. Um, and I just kind of went with it. When I wrote it, I wasn't thinking of it as a revenge story. I think it was more of a redemption story in a way to me. But then, you write the thing, you show it to people, they're like, oh, it's about revenge. You're like, I did not see that. Um, but yeah, I think not being so ingrained in a convention kind of worked out.
Well, it totally felt fresh, and I'm not a huge fan of revenge tales, so you handled that really well. Because sometimes they go to places where I'm just like, ah, that's just ugly and not so much for the story. But this didn't do that. It was beautiful through it also feeling like a revenge story. So, lastly, what's coming up next for you, and what are you currently working on?
So next for me is something that is totally very, very different, and I got to announce it last week. I will have two books coming out with Irwan. The first one titled The Iron Garden Sutra, and it's about a death monk and a group of academics who go on this lost generation ship and explore, and then a lot of bad things happen. In true Sway fashion, this was not written from positive emotion. And currently, I am working in the most boring sense on the edits for this book. And dealing with the very, very interesting feeling of going back to your work after not seeing it for almost a year and almost reading it fresh, almost reading it like you're relearning the story and being very pleasantly surprised and sometimes very grossed out. And kudos to me for writing something that grosses myself out, even though I created it. Oh, I have stories about that book. Ah, I wish it came out sooner. There's so much research that went into that book that was very particular and put me on a few watch lists.
Yeah, the writer's Google history. It's incriminating, right?
Oh yeah, you can't, you have to wipe that. You have to wipe it clean every single time. The worst is when your algorithms begin to cross and those searches start to cross-pollinate and you uncover horrors that you didn't know existed.
Know exactly what you're talking about. We'll have to have you back when that book comes out. If you'd like, we love to read that one and interview you again because that sounds wonderful. Dragonfly Gambit was absolutely wonderful. Before we go, I just have one quick announcement. On November 12th, I'm gonna drop a link in the chat right now for this. We're gonna be hosting an event for Eliane Bowie for the release of Club Contango, who I believe Eliane is a friend of yours. She's in the acknowledgments of the book, another wonderful writer that's coming out from Dark Matter Inc. Wonderful press. So please join us on November 12th for that. AD, I would like to thank you for sharing the excerpt and for this interview. Delightful to meet you and speak with you. Thank you to our audience for being here. If you haven't read it yet, please go out and get the Dragonfly Gambit, an absolutely fantastic first novella. Wonderful. AD Sway, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming.